All right. Well, if you want to turn with me to Romans 12 and 13, this will be my last one of the day, most likely, and then Kirk will finish us out, and we'll have Q&A later on. Romans 12 and 13. It's been mentioned a few times already that Romans 13 is probably the most famous passage in the New Testament for a doctrine of the state, what government is for. And if I get a chance, I'll probably at least read Romans 13 out loud, the first half of it, the first 7 verses. But a couple of things as we start. The first is that just to acknowledge something that maybe many of you have felt as you've read this passage before, if it's one you've looked at in light of what do we do politically as Christians, but certainly comes up a lot in church history, which is, to be honest, a sense of frustration that Romans 13 just doesn't answer so many of the questions we have about politics. And I think that sense of why doesn't this answer the questions we're asking? Why does it leave so many of the big topics on the side and not acknowledge them? Is it self-indicative of what it's doing and not doing? Kirk already mentioned last night, and I think he's right, that Romans 13 is presenting the ideal of the role of the state, not necessarily what the state always does with its power. When he says the state exists, and not just exists, but literally says the state is there to reward the good and to punish the bad. We can think of many moments in human history when that's the opposite of what states have done. Romans 13 is not naive about that. It's just saying, in general, the role of politics, the role of government, the role of organization in a fallen world is to keep order this way. Yes, there are exceptions. Sometimes even it's common, but nonetheless, this is what the state is for. The second thing is to point out, and this will be a big part of what we do over the next few minutes, is I think part of the sense of incompleteness we sense with Romans 13, the sense of frustration we might even have with it, that it doesn't answer our questions, that the answers it does give seem not to fit some of our scenarios today, is also partly because we isolate it from its context and we fail to see that Romans 13 continues a conversation that begins in Romans 12 about the church. And it's because we both overestimate the importance of the state in the world, but even more so underestimate the importance of the church, that we often fail to hear the full picture here. And as we're going to see, one of the real keys to seeing what's going on is to notice that the language and the concepts of Romans 13 are paralleling concepts Paul has already brought up in Romans 12. For instance, God's wrath, God's vengeance, what you do in response to evil is a conversation that already started in Romans 12 that doesn't just show up in Romans 13. Last thing to say by way of just setting it up, and then we'll look at it, is here's a way to connect it to what I did last night with the overview of the Old Testament, which is one of the ways to look at Romans 13 that I find helpful is instead of thinking, if Paul just wanted to sit down and write up an abstract philosophy of what the state is for, man, he didn't seem to do a great job of it. At the very least, it seems very incomplete, is to instead think, maybe like so often in Romans and so often in the New Testament, he's assuming that 90% of the iceberg that seems to be under the surface, you already know from the Old Testament. And therefore, he doesn't need to repeat itself. I think that's what's going on here. I think what Paul says in Romans 13 is just a very short summary of what the Hebrew prophets have already been saying for centuries. This is what Jeremiah 29 says. This is what the prophet Isaiah says about Assyria and Babylon. This is what all of the exilic and post-exilic writings of Israel regularly say to Israel in exile. And so, again, this is, I know, in some ways maybe a controversial conclusion that I reached last night, that not only is exile, diaspora, being sojourners in the world, pilgrims, and not those who have our own home available to us now. We are not those who are in charge of the current state of affairs, but like Israel, we are exiles in another homeland. We are sojourners. That's not just one option among many in the Old Testament. That's just not one metaphor among others, but both in the Old Testament itself and in the New Testament, 1 Peter, Hebrews, so many places, James, that is the continuing paradigm of Christian existence in the world. We are citizens of a kingdom that we do not yet live in, even as we are resident aliens and sojourners and exiles and pilgrims as we pass through this age. I think Romans 13 does feel incomplete, even frustrating, if you're looking at it through the lens of Davidic monarchy and thinking, whoever the ruler is here, he's supposed to be like David. Or if you're looking at it through the role of theocracy at Sinai, that he's supposed to mediate God's will fully over the people's life. But if you think about it as whoever the state is here, and it's clearly Rome that Paul is writing to, and whoever the ruler is, that the parallel is Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and we who are being called to submit to it are Israel in exile, the covenant people of God sojourning. All of a sudden, I think some connections begin to be made, lights begin to go up, that this is exilic, diaspora life under states that don't themselves acknowledge God, or at least the God of Israel fully, and what the people of God are supposed to do in those circumstances. So with all of that said, let me try to demonstrate some of that, try to defend it and flesh it out. Let me begin by reading Romans 12, starting in verse 9. And as I read this, you can hear it's kind of a collection of just a lot of moral exhortations. But two things about it. One is it really is similar to the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5 and 6 and 7, most New Testament scholars agree, Paul is very clearly echoing Jesus's teaching in the Sermon on the Mount. Love for enemies, praying for those who persecute you, not responding to evil with evil, but responding to it with good. All of this is based in Jesus's teaching. And two, that all of it, for the most part, has to do with either how we relate to one another within the church, or how we relate to outsiders who will often be perhaps hostile to us and not very welcoming. And what I want you to hear as I read this out loud is that so much of what Paul will say in Romans 13 builds on this argument, and that Romans 13, if isolated from this, will end up forcing it to answer some questions that it's not actually trying to answer. So let me start in chapter 12, verse 9. Let love be genuine or without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another, fellow Christians, with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing honor. A very countercultural value system. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be constant in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Seek to show hospitality. That paragraph more focused on life within the body of Christ. Next paragraph, mostly life outside of the body of Christ, life in the world. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil when they encounter you with evil, but rather give thought to do what is honorable, not just in the sight of God, not just in the sight of the body of Christ, in the sight of all human beings. The world's value system, again, that's kind of what Paul means in other places, is aspire to live quiet lives. Try to, when the culture doesn't actively conflict with the gospel, even if it's only some places, as it always is, try to live up to the best aspirations of the culture, even if it's something that's not based in that culture itself on the gospel. Try to do that. Try to find that common ground. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably at all, constantly being confrontational, constantly having non-Christians say, oh, this guy's the worst, isn't a calling card to carry around and say, look how faithful I am to Jesus. It's just a reminder that you don't really smell like Jesus and everybody hates your presence in the room. That doesn't mean that everybody will always like us, but we should strive, insofar as it depends on us, to win friends and not make enemies, to be people of peace and flourishing and not confrontation and conflict. And beloved, never avenge yourselves, but rather leave room for God's wrath. Trust God to deal with evil, with wrath and vengeance. You respond to evil with good, with mercy, with faithfulness, because it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. And this is always one of the most bizarre parts of this passage. What exactly is Paul saying here? Because as you do this, as you love your enemy, rather than punish your enemy, you will heap burning coals on his head. We'll come back to that in a bit. Conclusion. Do not be overcome by evil. Rather, overcome evil with good. Notice a couple of things about this. One is, as I said, lots of parallels with what Paul goes on to say in Romans 13. You could say the final paragraph in Romans 12 and the first 7 verses of chapter 13, while one deals with the church in its encounter with the world, the other deals with the state in its encounter with the world, are both dominated by the concern of how ought you to respond to evil? How ought you to try to counter injustice when it happens? And notice that the church in Romans 12, in verses 14 through 21 especially, is given one very specific set of instructions. The state is given a very different set of instructions for how it responds to evil. This is one of the reasons that most Christian traditions understand it to be a strong distinction, not brought on by the fall, but authorized by God, that the church and the state are not the same thing, that they are distinct, and that they have different roles that cannot be collapsed into each other. I think that's clearly there here. But notice the language of vengeance and wrath also reappear in Romans 13 with respect to the state, but they first showed up in Romans 12. Part of what Romans 13, 1 through 7 is clearly doing is answering a question that the end of Romans 12 clearly raises, which is, we've just been told the reason we can respond to evil and violence and injustice with justice rather than more injustice, mercy rather than punishment, love rather than hate, blessing rather than more cursing as we ourselves receive, is because we can trust God to take vengeance. We don't need to be the agents of that. And that, of course, raises the question, well, how does God take vengeance on people who do evil? How does God's wrath get expressed in the world in such a way that we as Christians, we as the church, don't need to take matters into our own hands as vigilantes? And Romans 13, 1 through 7 is the answer to that, or at least a part of the answer. Part of the answer is the final judgment, which the end of Romans 13 eventually gets to, that Christ will come again, he will set all things right. But part of it is the state exists in the world to be the instrument of God responding to evil with force, with the sword. The state does not bear the sword in vain, with coercion. And this often catches people off guard, but I think there's justification for me saying this. The state exists to respond to evil with evil, among other things. When someone does evil, and we are called not to respond with evil, what that means is if they hit you, you don't hit them back. If they kill your brother, you don't kill their brother. But when it says the state, in a kind of eye for an eye way, responds to evil by bringing punishment, that's saying God has responded to the state, has authorized the state to do something that would never have happened in creation if evil didn't first exist, namely to respond with violence, to respond with punishment, to respond by harming those who have done evil in order to prevent them from continuing to do that and to protect those who are their victims. The state is authorized to, in a very real sense, use evil as a response to evil, both to keep evil from becoming more contagious, more outlandish, and to protect the victims of those who do evil. That makes the state's job very dangerous, but also very important in the world. Notice, and here's the next thing I want to mention, and I won't be too long on this. We'll get a chance to talk about this plenty, and this one usually brings disagreements to the surface and different views very quickly, which is one of the reasons I think this passage is helpful. Is here's another thing that as I've read the different views in church history more as the years get on, there's actually a almost unanimous sense of agreement with what I'm about to say, But where the next conversation goes is incredibly diverse, which is, here's the observation I want to make. In Romans 12, verses 14 through 21, it is concerned with, what do I do as a Christian? What do we do as the church when someone does evil against us? Romans 13 is concerned with, what does the state do when someone does evil against the state, against a citizen, whatever. And here's the observation that there's almost complete consensus on. You cannot, as a human being, at the same time, in the same situation, respond to the same act of evil, both in a Romans 12, 14 through 21 kind of way, and a Romans 13, 1 through 7 kind of way. You cannot respond to evil with good and not respond to evil with more evil. You cannot bless those who persecute you and love those who hate you, and at the same time pull out a sword and kill them. You cannot do both of those things at the same time, to the same act, in the same moment of sin, of injustice, of evil. Which means that Romans 12 and 13 assumes some kind of dualism, to put it that way. The question, the million-dollar question, is what kind of dualism it assumes. Martin Luther thought the dualism, and this is the two kingdoms view, was a dualism between us as private individuals and us as public citizens. That Martin Luther thought that in your religious life, either with other Christians or in the privacy of your own home, you are forbidden from using violence and coercion to respond to evil. But when you are out on the streets, so to speak, whether you're a police officer or whether it's just when somebody breaks in and you need to defend your family, that there are two, so to speak, spheres of your own life as an individual. And in one sphere, you need to follow the Sermon on the Mount. And in the other sphere, you get to follow Romans 13 and do the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. The main problem with that view, among others, is that it begs the question, how do I know when I'm standing in one sphere or the other? Because there's no clear compartmentalization between the different situations of our life. Even if I'm in a private moment, if I'm a husband and a father, or if I'm this or I'm this, I'm never just a private citizen. So how do I know which set of rules to rely on? Which is why the two kingdoms view, I think, often flounders on this passage. Another view is that there is the kingdom of Christ and the kingdom of the world. That is, the Sermon on the Mount is for how we live with one another in the church, and Romans 13 is the set of principles we use out in the world, whether with non-Christians in general, as police officers, as officials, or in any situation where you just got to get your hands dirty to do it. And again, that raises lots of questions of, how do I know? And it also raises questions. Paul seems to be applying the Sermon on the Mount in Romans 12 precisely to our relationships with non-Christians, not just with people in the church. What I think the dualism ultimately is, and most Christian traditions finally see this, is that it's the dualism between the church and the state. The church exists in the world to respond to evil in the way of Jesus. Like the Sermon on the Mount, the state exists in the world to respond to evil with the sword, and that God has authorized both of those. One is not sinful and the other righteous. They're both authorized by God, but they are different. They have different aims, they have different outcomes, they have different rationales. Now, of course, and I'm intentionally not going to answer this right now. You can bring it up in Q&A if you want. One of the questions this always brings up is, can Christians not only participate in the church's ministry of responding to evil the way Jesus did, but can they also serve as police officers? Can they also serve in the military? Can they also be in judicial and legislative and executive roles where they would need to be a part of the process of Caesar's sword coming down? The overwhelming majority view of church history is that yes, they can. There has always been a minority position from the very beginning that tries to take seriously, as Christians, we not only ought to focus on the Romans 12 thing, we are limited to the Romans 12 thing. I think that's a really hard debate. It is an important debate, but what I don't want us to lose track of is the overall emphasis of Romans 12 and 13, which is, as the church, our job is neither to just ensure the state is always doing its job, because the state will do that, and it always does in different civilizations, imperfectly, but it does that. And if it doesn't, then that whole culture ceases to exist and drowns in chaos. But also to remember that not only do we have a different vocation than that, and here's the final thing I want to argue, the church's vocation of responding to evil is not only different than the state's vocation of responding to evil, that it is more important and it is more effective than the state's way of responding to evil. And here's the distinction I want to make. At the very end of Romans 12, it sums up everything in verses 14 to 21 by saying, therefore, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It sums up the call of how the church responds to injustice, evil, the presence of sin in the world. This is the way of Jesus, and it must also be the way of the church. Here's a couple of things about this which are worth pointing out because they can be missed. The first is in verse 21, this is where my name comes from. I don't exactly know why my parents named me Nicholas. I think they just like the way it sounds. We're not Greek. Apparently, I do have some Russian blood, but I don't think they even knew that at the time. So I think they just like the way it sounds. I like the name Nick. I'm glad they named me that. But the name Nicholas actually comes from the verb here, overcome. Nikao in Greek is overcome, defeat, be victorious. It is a militaristic battle word for victory. Laos is the peoples. So Nikao, Laos, is one who overcomes or defeats or has victory over the peoples. That's why all the Russian czars took the name. So maybe my parents were imperialistic. I don't know. But that's where my name comes from. What I want you to hear and see is that what Paul is saying here at the end of Romans 12 is that we respond to evil with good, not just because it's what God commands, not just because it's what Jesus did, but because it actually defeats evil, because it actually constitutes a victory over evil. It is actually a political achievement of defeating evil. Whatever Paul is saying about the state in Romans 13, even if it's ideal, as Kirk rightly said, the best case scenario of the state's response to evil is to restrain it. Responding to evil with evil, at best, restrains evil from breaking out even more and protects victims from being victimized even more. And that's not nothing. It is really important that the state does that. But here's what the state bringing down the sword on evil will never do. It will never eradicate evil from the world. It will never defeat evil's presence. It will never get at the heart of why evil exists in this situation to begin with. And at its worst, whether because of how tenacious evil is in the human heart, or because those who lead the state are themselves evil, responding to evil with evil often unintentionally or intentionally becomes part of the cycle of actually leading to more evil. Sometimes responding to evil with evil leads to more evil, leads to cycles of evil. That's one of the reasons Gandhi said the problem with an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth is we'd all be blind and we'd all have no teeth. That we'd all be able to find something in each other's lives to always endlessly be retributive towards each other on. And you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. You hit me, I'm going to hit you even harder. And it often sets off cycles like that in history. Think of the Middle East. Think of Europe in the 20th century. Think of so many places. But even if that doesn't happen, the end result of the state's use of force restrains evil. But evil is still there. And this is one of the reasons, no matter what we do in politics as Christians, no matter what we do in the government, it is important. We are called there. The state's role is essential. I don't want you to hear me playing that down at all, but it is a secondary role. It is a temporary role. And it is, with respect to evil, a restraining role. And so this is what I think the otherwise weird image at the end of Romans 12 means. When your enemy commits an act of evil against you, and you not only don't respond with evil in kind, but you respond positively with an act of love, mercy, of compassion, of service, of humanity, to actively love your enemy, Paul says the result is you have poured burning coals on your enemy's head. Now, this is really strange, and it frustrates interpreters in no ends, because either it sounds like Paul is saying deep down, to go back to what Kirk said earlier, deep down, your deepest motivation for loving your enemy is knowing, oh, God is going to drop burning coals on their head, and me, by being nice to you now, ensures a bigger, heaping of burning coals from God later on. And so it makes Christian love motivated by sadism, motivated by retribution. And that just can't be the case. On the other hand, the instinct of being motivated by destroying your enemy can't be the motivation for loving your enemy. Certainly wasn't Jesus's motivation for loving us. Sometimes causes interpreters to go to the other extreme and try to do exegetical gymnastics where somehow getting burning coals dumped on your head is a good thing, right? And like, no matter how many anthropologists look at different cultures in the history of the world, there is no culture in human history that will ever be discovered where, among the other love languages, words of affirmation, physical touch, quality time, that some culture has, my love language is I love getting burning coals dumped on my head, right? Like, this is not a good thing for anybody anywhere. This is clearly an act of judgment. It's clearly a negative occurrence. Here's what I think Paul is saying. Burning coals dumped on your enemy's head is not referring to your motivation. It's referring to the outcome objectively, not your subjective motivation. It means this, so to speak. It means that when your enemy commits an act of evil against you and you respond with love, you win and he loses. Righteousness triumphs and evil is defeated, both because it's snuffed out, but also because not always, sometimes not even often, but not rarely either, that often becomes the moment where the Spirit of God breaks through in somebody's life, when the mercy of Jesus is embodied in a Christian or the church. Think of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables. Think of so many people throughout history that when the church responds to evil with active love, this often becomes the moment, as it did with the Apostle Paul, as it did with so many others. Paul regularly refers to himself as a former enemy that God defeated. How did God defeat Paul? Not with evil, not with strength, but with love, with mercy, with compassion. This is how we are defeated by King Jesus. This is how every one of us has been enlisted in his army and has laid down our alliance with evil. And so here's the vision that Romans 12 and 13 holds before us. Until Jesus comes back, the state plays a necessary and important role in restraining evil with force. If the only strategy to responding to evil in the world was the Sermon on the Mount, there would be many people who would be transformed, but there would also be a lot more evil in the world than is currently happening. The church doing the Sermon on the Mount is not God's only strategy for responding to evil. The state has a different strategy. But not only does the church need to not allow the state strategy to become ours, but we need to remember our strategy is even more important than the state strategy is, which is why I think kingdom advancing, kingdom coming should be limited to the advance of the gospel in the church as people are enlisted in Jesus's army and become disciples, and shouldn't be language we use to describe there's more Republicans or more Democrats in office than there were before I voted. That's not what we're doing when the state gets a little more aligned with what we think goodness and evil and righteousness actually is. And so let me end with an example, and then we'll do some Q&A. Here's one situation in the 20th century with three responses that I think illustrate what Paul is talking about here. In the 1950s and the 1960s, the South in particular, but America in general, had been living under Jim Crow laws and a lot of other leftovers from our awful racist history in this area, the slavery laws, for a long time. What do you do as a Christian, as a human being, when rampant racism exists in a culture? Well, one thing you could do is turn the other eye and do nothing about it. That's the worst response you can have to evil in the world. To just say, you know what? It's evil, but I'm just not going to do anything about it. Letting the racism of America's history continue to reign unchallenged is the worst possible response to it, apart from maybe even naming it as good. A second response, which happened in the 1960s, was for the state to take direct intervention by desegregating schools in the South by sending the National Guard and the militia into the South. And that did desegregate the South in its schools and in some other ways. And here's the thing, I think the federal government was right to do that because that is evil and it ought not to be tolerated. And the state is given the sword for situations precisely like that. But two things. One, it not only didn't eradicate racism from human hearts, you can make an argument that in addition to restraining it, which it did, and protecting victims from it, which it did, that it also, and this is not the fault of the state, it's just the way evil works in the world, it also was connected to the resurgence of white supremacy and racism in the South. The rise, the resurgence of the KKK, the resurgence of white supremacy is directly connected to the South and white Southerners experiencing the state coming in coercively, violently with the sword. And there is a very real sense, even though I think it was the right thing to do, that what this federal government did was a form of evil. Human beings ought to never experience those from outside of our community coming in with bigger guns and more might and forcing us to do something. It was justified in that moment because that's what God is a favor, but that is a form of evil. And most people respond to that, not with, oh yeah, we were wrong, but with, I hate you even more than I did before. And there is such resentment in certain pockets of the South that have directly been re-accelerated and intensified even more by the intervention of the government into the Jim Crow South. But all things being equal, that was the right thing to do, much better than letting Jim Crow laws continue. But here was a third possibility, and another one that happened. Martin Luther King Jr., the African American church, and a number of others from as Christians and non-Christians throughout the country committed to a nonviolent way of Jesus, Romans 12, 14 through 21, which on the one hand required much more patience, much more suffering on their account, and inflicted much less suffering on their enemies than the federal government inflicted on their enemies. They suffered a lot more. And here's the thing, there is no argument that the civil rights movement was infinitely more effective than the federal government in the 1960s. It didn't solve everything. There's still a lot to be done. But the civil rights movement not only restrained a lot of evil, it not only helped and saved a lot of victims, it defeated evil in the hearts and lives of tens and hundreds of thousands of Americans who were defeated in their commitment to racist evil because of their experience of that kind of truth-telling and love in a way that the state's sword never brings about in human hearts. The church is called to those kinds of activities in the world, trusting that there's also this other thing, the state, and we can trust the state to generally be doing this, insofar as we can support the state by voting, by reminding the state of what it's there for, we should, but let's not lose track that the church's existence in the world is itself, one, politically significant for responding to evil, and two, more politically significant for responding to evil than the United States government or any state ever will be. If the church is not the church, that will be the ultimate way to be irresponsible about evil in any society. And so this is the heart of what I think is strong about the countercultural view, insofar as the countercultural view is tempted at times to say Romans 12, not Romans 13, it's making a mistake. But insofar as it's saying our primary calling is Romans 12, not Romans 13, and just like with Jesus, this is the main way God deals with evil in the world, I think it's right. And so again, it reminds me that one of the many reasons I love being a pastor is that I think by God's grace, what I do in discipling, teaching, mentoring actually deals with evil in a more effective way than politicians' way of responding to evil does. Both in the short run, but especially in the long run. This is why no politics can save us if our hearts are dominated by evil, and if our hearts are freed from their grip of evil. It's not that politics becomes unimportant, but it does all of a sudden become more obvious that, again, this is there in scripture so many times, it's common sense, that a people who know how to love their enemies are a people that Caesar will not need to bring his sword down on very often. And so in one sense, the church's job is to eventually put the state out of business. That won't happen until Jesus comes back, but that's always our aim. Let me stop there. I'm sure lots of different directions you could go with this. Questions, thoughts?